My name is Sorrell Hillman. I'm the chief of the New York bureau of Time magazine. Today, I'm going to be talking with John Mason Brown, that distinguished triple threat, author, lecturer, critic, known to you on television or perhaps as a judge of the Book of the Month Club. During this first session, we're going to cover something of Mr. Brown's wide range of experience, from a stage-struck childhood in Louisville, Kentucky, to a maturity embracing the whole range of American culture. And we're going to take time out to digress whenever the mood strikes us. Well, Mr. Brown, to begin with, I think everybody knows what a distinguished dramatic critic you've been for many years. And so the obvious first question is, how did you get interested in the theater?
I happened to be exposed to it in a period when it was much easier to be exposed to the theater than it is now. I would like to explain, if perhaps those with attentive ears have not already guessed, that I was born away from New York, not in the far north, but as a matter of fact in Kentucky. And when I was born, and that was before you were born, Mr. Hillman, that was 1900, a year I cannot forget, because the calendar is a remorseless reminder. There was not only a very active theater in New York, but a very active theater on the road. And in Louisville, as we pronounce it, in Louisville, in those days, there were touring companies, and admirable ones, with original New York cast that played the city for at least a week. And I, in those days, went again and again to the theater, and there developed this early passion for it.
What exactly was the theater like in Louisville in your boyhood, Mr. Brown? I mean, what are some of the plays that you saw or some of the performances that you remember?
Well, I can tell you what theater going was like. Let me begin there. In those days, you sat in the top balcony, which was illiberally and disgracefully known as nigger heaven, and you rejoiced in being able to pay 50 cents or $1 to crowd into the top balcony and sit on wooden benches. I think the first play I ever saw was The Roundup, which was a wonderful Western melodrama. This was before movies had taken over the Westerns. This was when they had actual horses, actual Indians, and one...
Surely no actual horses on stage.
Sir, even on the stage of Macaulay's, there was something like 12 horses that walked up a papier-mâché mountain, and the federal troops, I'm sure they were federal troops, shot one of the evil Indians 3/4 of the way through the second act. I'm not speaking physiologically, but just putting him on the set. And the Indian, this was wonderful, fell over the cliff, and his feet were held by ropes, hidden, and he dangled down as a cadaver until the curtain. And then he got up and took a splendid curtain call I hope to get the blood out of his head. I recall spectacles, of course, not as being any more than a certain aspect of the theater at that time. Don't forget, this was the period in which the major emphasis, in terms of American theater, was on the actor rather than the dramatist. It wasn't until the 20s that the dramatists, the American dramatists, came into their full recognition. And what the dramatists had to say then became more important than the way in which actors said it. You had an emerging and very changing theater, not at all like our theater today. It was a much more infantile theater, childish really in its thinking, and the audience was still, in the nicest sense of the word, simple-minded. It was not the sophisticated audience that the theater now has. My conviction is that the more you educate readers or audiences, the more they come to demand. The better the product they get used to, the better the product they insist upon. And what has happened is that the theater has become so sophisticated in its demand that it presents very special problems to those working in it, playwrights particularly.
Getting to the actors, who, before Fess Parker, dared to put on a coonskin cap and venture into the Kentucky wilds? Whom did you see in Louisville?
I saw Robert Mantell when I was 9. This was, I believe, they always say 9. I don't know who knew that. In King Lear. That was the only part at that time that Robert Mantell was young enough to play, though that never kept him from playing Romeo. And, of course, Southern and Marlowe was the god and goddess of my idolatry. And whenever they came to Louisville for a full week in Shakespearean repertory, my family allowed me to go. But I saw people such as John Barrymore. I saw John Barrymore in Galsworthy's Justice. It was one of his great performances. It was the first time that I myself had seen John Barrymore on the stage. And of course, he was famous as a comic actor. But in Justice, he made the transition from the popular comedian into the serious player. This was the first time he mobilized those unequaled talents of his for intensity, the projection of inner grief, and giving grace to ugliness. I don't know how else to describe it. The supreme scene in Justice, from the point of view of acting, was the scene in pantomime, or dumb show as it's technically called. It was the scene in which Barrymore was shown in his prison cell, alone. It was mealtime. The other prisoners down the cell block, the long corridor, became panicked with hunger, and they began to beat on their tin dishes against the wall. And Barrymore's own nerves were going to pieces as he listened to this crescendo of mounting complaint. And then suddenly he went totally to pieces. And as the blackout came, as the fadeaway, here was this wreck of a man. As a matter of fact, Galsworthy's play had a decided effect upon prison reform in Britain. May I go on for one more moment about Barrymore? So many younger people, alas, remember him only as the great profile of Hollywood, or worse still, remember him in terms of his appalling travesty of his former greatness in My Darling Children. Barrymore, towards the end of his career, due to his lack of personal self-discipline, spent those years largely sliding down the banisters of his once great reputation. But there were about 5 or 6 years, from 1919, I believe this is correct, until about 1926 or 7, when Barrymore was the most exciting and palpitant figure, acting figure, that our theatre had known, at least in my time. Those were the years in which he turned to Shakespeare, to Richard, and then magnificently to Hamlet. And Barrymore, who had this indescribable radiance, this luminous quality, this sense of intensity and excitement that no other American actor at that time equaled, or I don't think any has equal since. Barrymore thereafter, because he did not have the discipline that could sustain genius, faded out even as a genius. It is often much easier for a person who has talent backed by character to succeed than a person to succeed who has genius unfortified by character. And unfortunately, Barrymore did not have that sustaining or fortifying self-discipline which is character in the arts.
Did you act or write for the theater when you were growing up in Louisville?
Oh, I played King Lear, what I could remember of it, which was intermittent, in the attic with a cousin as Cordelia and a curtain as a train. It was not very successful, and Booth was unchallenged.
I think some people might wonder why a 9 or 10-year-old boy would choose the doddering senility of Lear over the athletic ardors of Romeo. How come Lear?
Lear made a profound impression upon me. It had all of the glorious horrors that childhood delights in. Needless to say, I was unable to remember more than a few lines, such as "Howl, howl, howl, O ye men of stones," and so forth. But you could do in pantomime what you couldn't remember in Shakespeare's language. I say you could do it because the people who composed the audience were either members of my family dragged there to pay a penny, or the colored servants that we had. And they were very kind to us in their judgments and put up with the horrors that must have been ours. My cousin who played Cordelia was so young that she couldn't remember any lines, but that was all right. I didn't use her until after she had been hanged, so she had an excuse.
Well, you eventually went on to Harvard, didn't you?
It was not a unique thing. A good many people have gone on to Harvard, but I went on.
I meant specifically because of the theater.
It was the theater and the late George Pierce Baker, the great teacher of drama, who conducted the famous course, the English 47, and ran the 47 workshop, where the plays written in English 47 were produced. That was the magnet for me that drew me to Harvard. My family, my father, my uncle, my grandfather, had all gone to Yale, and my apostasy was due to this early passion for the drama. And as soon as I left Harvard, Baker went to Yale.
When you got to Harvard, you didn't act yourself, did you?
Oh, yes.
What did you do?
I think, isn't it true, isn't it supposed to be true, that everyone is a frustrated actor? My talents were always amateur, as I became quickly aware. I acted in the Harvard Dramatic Club plays. I acted in a play from the French, a translation, The Violins of Cremona. And if you want a proper assessment of my acting skill, may I quote from my distinguished confrère, Brooks Atkinson, who was then writing as a second-string critic for the Boston Transcript. There were 4 people, I believe, in this play, and I was the 4th and the president of the Dramatic Club, and Mr. Atkinson described the others with high praise, and he said the rest of the cast sputtered and spurted. That was my acting.
So you wanted to become a drama critic so you could eventually get back at Mr. Atkinson.
Well, that wasn't the total motive. There were other reasons, too. No, I acted in other parts. In those days, my speech, which is now highly, and still highly, shall we say, polyglot, was almost totally Uncle Tom, and I usually played Uncle Tom parts in plays by Thomas Wolfe or Philip Barry, or some of the men who happened to be at Harvard at that time taking courses in the drama.
Well, now, Barry and Wolfe were in your class at Harvard?
No, there have been some people in the world older than I, and they were ahead of me. They were graduate students when I happened to, at last, get into Baker's workshop and then finally into the acting company.
Weren't you ever in one of Wolfe's plays?
I was in a very appalling play by Thomas Wolfe, a one-act, a play called The Mountains. And in this particular play, I played a Southern doctor, I believe, some healing tapeworm. And the curtain went up on this setting. I've never forgotten it. It was in a cabin in the Smokies and in the Carolina Mountains, and on the small stage of the Idler Theater at Radcliffe. And through the windows at the back, you could see cutouts representing the Smoky Mountains, one of which was larger than the other 2. And Thomas Wolfe was discovered, that was a stage direction term in those days, sitting alone at a desk, surrounded by books. And he sat absolutely silent for a minute and a half. And he was indulging in that Faustian quest for knowledge, which was always the great quality of Tom Wolfe. And suddenly, after that minute and a half, which seemed an eternity on the stage, he pushed all of the books on the floor. And he pulled himself up to his pine tree height. He went upstage and shook his fist at that highest peak. And he said, "Damn you, Baldpate, you are hemming me in." And that was the whole attitude of protest, which lasted, I think, and was successfully stated at last in the novels.
He lacked those keys to Baldpate.
He lacked the key to the Baldpate of the theater. Indeed, he did.
I'd just like to ask one other thing about Wolfe before we leave him, and that is, as a dramatic critic, why do you think it was that Wolfe was so unsuccessful as a playwright and as opposed to his success as a novelist?
You might just as well ask me, why would the Mississippi River be a failure as a swimming pool? Thomas Wolfe was a person absolutely torrential in his talents. As we know, he was a superb author, but even as an author, and a superb one, he depended first upon Max Perkins at Scribner's, then upon Ed Aswell at Harper's, for that editing which channeled, to use that awful verb, channeled this flow of the fiction into acceptable novel form. And the restricted form, the telegraphic form of emotion, which is the theater, is something Tom, though he wanted to, I don't think could ever himself have mastered, any more than Henry James, who also had this unzippered desire to be a playwright, was never able to achieve for himself the success that others achieved for him posthumously by dramatizing his novels.
On the other hand, George Pierce Baker was a very severe, strict constructionist in the theater, wasn't he?
I think Professor Baker seems much more corseted in his opinions than he actually was. You see, Professor Baker, and this was the remarkable thing about him, in person, in the classroom, with the students who worked with him, was always the contemporary of his most recent class. In print, due to the frigidity of print and the fixative upon ideas which print imposes, he seemed to be the champion of the well-made play. Professor Baker was someone who had very little sympathy, I regret to say, with George Bernard Shaw, one of my idols. He did prefer the craftsmanship of Pinero and Jones, but as the years went on, he certainly recognized the radiant merits of such a student of his as Eugene O'Neill, and he came to recognize the values of expressionism. Baker once defined a play, if you can define anything, he defined it as well as most people can, better than most, when he said a play is an accurately conveyed emotion. In other words, any form that can accurately convey the emotion is correct.
It's curious that both Wolfe and Philip Barry should have been there together, because I don't suppose you could have found 2 more disparate playwrights.
Are you saying disparate?
I'm saying it desperately.
Well, no, they, of course, were totally different in temperament, endowment, in point of view, background, everything else. But I think that certainly one of the virtues of a school is that it doesn't turn everyone to peas in one pod. The virtue of the 47 workshop and of Baker was that he attracted all kinds of talents, and furthermore encouraged each according to his bent.
Everyone agrees that it takes a certain special alchemy to make a professor great. What was the magic in Baker?
Baker had that passionate interest in the work of others, which is the first mark of good teaching. Baker also was an extremely able sight reader, and one of the most astonishing things was the way in which he could pick up a script, and this man, this most distinguished-looking man, would suddenly be called upon to play an Irish cop, a Manhattan prostitute, a Cockney, or anything that you choose, any character, and his vocal range was astonishing, truly astonishing. And that, of course, created the illusion. The other thing was that the whole premise of Baker's 47 workshop was that it brought together people who happened to share the same professional hope and interest. Once they came unified by that, they were a group, and that it was his ability to evoke this group interest and to encourage the individual's self-belief while facing the rigors of composition that I think made him, these were among the things which made him so preeminent a teacher. Teaching is, after all, evocation. No one can teach anyone anything except you can housebreak dogs and children, and that's about all you can definitely do. The great end of teaching, I believe, is reached when the teacher has persuaded the student that he must teach himself, when he has led him to the door of the library and made him want to stay inside, or led him to the desk and given him paper and pencil and then enough conviction and enough inflamed interest to write. Heyward Broun, another student of Baker's, in this case in the history courses rather than the playwriting courses, when Baker went to Yale, and Broun wrote a famous piece because of the Workshop 47, a football piece, saying the score is now Yale 47, Harvard 0. Broun pointed out that though most people thought of Baker and admired him because of his distinguished playwright graduates, they forgot, said Broun, that his greatest contribution to the theater had been the people that he had cured, the men who went back into banking or happily returned to a garage, or the typists who stuck to their typewriters. You see, and there was a point there. Elimination, the destruction of the unwanted foliage, the massacre of the innocents, the protection of the arts from the incompetence is one of the first and eternal duties, obligations of criticism. And that was one of Baker's great services.
Before we leave Harvard altogether, as one who spent
No
most
one
of
never
his...
does, may
Oh,
I say.
I know.
And you went to Harvard, too, sir.
I know that from all the dunning letters I got from them, but as one who spent most of his time in the beer halls there, when you weren't busy with the theater...
Now, are you speaking of you?
I'm speaking of myself,
Let's
yes.
get this clear.
What did you do for fun at Harvard? Did you take out the Radcliffe and Wellesley girls, or did you go down to Scully Square or the burlesque houses?
Well,
or...
really, Mr. Mike Wallace, this is not a question I feel called upon to answer. I did many things for fun. I will say that in those benighted days, and this is no longer true, we did not, as a rule, take out Radcliffe girls.
Matter of taste?
No, in those days, Radcliffe girls were almost untouchables. I don't mean to say they're touchables
Still
today.
true.
But I know they're deeply admired now. And Harvard now, of course, is openly coeducational. Openly and proudly, and I think gainfully, in every way, coeducational.
By the time you got through Harvard then, in what, 1920?
No, I'm sorry I looked that tired. It was 1923.
At any rate, by that time, you had decided to be a critic?
I can't say that, like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, or Saul it was on the way before he changed, I had not reached, in Mr. to come to a latter-day saint, Billy Graham, I had not reached the decision. No, I had decided to write about the theater, but the decision came naturally when I had a release in print. You can decide to be a critic, and almost everyone in an audience is a self-elected critic, but you are not a critic until you are paid for having opinions.
Mm-hmm.
That is the trade rule. You may not know a thing under the sun about the theater. You may be the world's worst writer and the world's worst critic. But to be a member of the New York Drama Critics Circle does not involve any examinations as for the law or for medicine. It means only that some editor on a New York paper or weekly or monthly, out of knowledge or ignorance, out of contempt for the theater or love for it, or out of sheer family obligation or past misbehavior, has hired you to protect his errors. Now, that's all it means.
A highly Shavian sentence.
Thank you. It was a close shaving because I didn't think I'd get to the end of it.
But you didn't simply leap into criticism after college. How did you go about hooking an editor?
I had already made plans to go abroad the next year to study the theater. And I went abroad with Donald Oehlenschläger, a classmate at Harvard. We had both been in the dramatic club, worked for Baker. He is, of course, the distinguished stage designer and the professor of stage design at the Yale Drama School. And we had this amazing 12 months studying the theater from everywhere, from England to Scandinavia, across Germany, Austria to Romania to Turkey, back through Greece to Rome to France, etc., and then home. Don Oehlenschläger had a very opulent scholarship. I always remember this with green envy. And I think I had $700, but due to the kindness of H.T. Parker, a critic on the Boston Transcript, and the kindness of the editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal, where I had served as a cub reporter previously for 2 summers, these two men asked me to write weekly pieces, or every 2 weeks, one every 2 weeks, for each space for each paper, bi-weekly, on the European theater, and the excitement that they must have felt in the mountain areas of Kentucky as I reported upon the German drama in Stuttgart and what was happening to Schiller and the expressionistic plays. Well, that must have been incalculable. I don't know whether...
Shaped the whole course of democratic politics in Kentucky, probably.
I think maybe it made Happy Chandler unhappy. I don't know.
What did you find in the theater in Europe to set Kentucky aquiver?
The theater in Europe after World War I was undergoing an extremely interesting development. Poverty has its decided advantages from the point of view not of the life of artists, but the creation of art. Germany, after World War I, was, of course, going through a period of inflation and of high poverty. Germany had always had a fine theater. Even the Kaiser, who destroyed so much of German culture, could not destroy the strength or the variety or the extraordinary excellence of the state repertory theaters and the local theaters. The German theater, I said, was undergoing poverty. This poverty meant that the former over-lavish productions were no longer being made. Artists instead turned to a simple suggestion rather than an ornate set. You turned to what was then known as impressionism or expressionism, and finally cubism in the theater. And the method of production changed, and it became infinitely more suggestive as it became less and less reproductive, because the great line about realism in the theater was once spoken by Arthur Hopkins, who, when David Belasco, the American producer who was the arch exponent of the realistic setting with every lamp just right and the water running and the gas stove turned on, when David Belasco did a play called The Governor's Lady, and there was a scene in a child's restaurant, Arthur Hopkins, who despised this kind of literal reproduction, said, when you really came to think about it, the only remarkable thing about that setting in Child's, where the pancakes were being flipped, was that it was not real. And he said, that closeness to reality that does not create art. Years ago, Wagner pointed out, in a line that almost everyone remembers, that where life ends, art begins. And in the European theater in the 20s, the revolt was against the literal, the supernaturalistic, and into the realm of suggestion and the ignited mind and the eye that had a chance to see in a different way.
You seem to be having a tremendous ball in Europe. What on earth made you give up such a soft touch and come home again?
When I was in Europe, I had met just before I left the late Edith J.R. Isaacs, who was the editor of the old Theater Arts Monthly. She sent me a wire saying, would I become editor on Theater Arts Monthly? And I always remember the phrase. You see, it was dedicated to art. It was very aesthetic. She said, we can pay you a bread but not a butter salary. And I sent her a jubilant cable of acceptance. And it broke her heart and the heart of her business manager, because they wanted an assistant business manager, and realized that anyone so unaware of the value of money and with only a bread salary coming up some months off, who would send a wire of that length and ecstasy, was not prepared for business. However, I did stay on Theatre Arts for happy years, and then did become its drama critic for 3.5 of those. And then after that, moved on to the New York daily newspapers. And after the war, when I had left the Navy, I was on the Saturday Review, and I did a column there, almost weekly, called Seeing Things, for 10 years.
Well, this brings up a point that I think anybody who's at all interested in the theater is bound to raise at some point or other, and that is, as a theater critic, did you have, and this probably sounds terribly pompous, but did you have certain fixed standards or ideas of what the theater should or should not do that you tried to adhere to?
I certainly hope I had standards about the theater, and informed standards. I mean, as far as knowledge goes, book learning. But book learning has little to do with what is the actuality of performance. To be alive, the theater has to be tonight what it wasn't yesterday, if it's ever to move ahead. And to merely regurgitate or recollect the past, or to follow the past, is to enslave the present and the future. A critic is, with or without his own choice, a reactor. What he is writing, you hope from informed perceptions, is his reflex to the particular production or performance that is before him. A critic, in the last analysis, can speak only for himself, and that is hard enough. I think a critic is someone who is trying to feel his thoughts and think his feelings. He is someone in the theater who, though he is part of an audience, very definitely part of an audience, is a person who has to remain to a certain extent himself. He is a single person in the midst of many, yet he writes from the many in terms of himself. I think that the common misconception about the mere words critic or criticism is that they imply attack or denunciation. Attack is necessary for the health of the theater, but I believe the older a person becomes as a critic, the more he comes to realize that it is far easier to descend to denunciation than it is to rise to appreciation. You will find that critics who are superb at satire are embarrassed when they have to praise. They have much more fun when the nose is to the thumb, rather than when the hand is over the heart.
Well, I think of two other critics, other famous critics who were tremendously important figures in the Broadway scene in those years when you were first writing criticism, George G. Nathan and Alexander Woollcott. And I remember a wonderful introduction that you wrote to the Viking Portable collection of Woollcott's writings, in which you talked about his marvelous, if uncritical, enthusiasm. And I think you made the point that Woollcott's enthusiasm, even when it was misdirected, made him a captivating person to read, and somebody who was a veritable Pied Piper of the theater for that reason.
Well, Woollcott and George G. Nathan had only one quality in common, and that was that each man had an enormous love for the theater, expressed in totally different ways, and each man was able to retain the heat of his reaction in the prose that was the reflex to a performance. I think, you see, Woollcott was a man who boasted that he hoped on his grave they would say, as his epitaph, that he was a perhapsless man, that he wouldn't say, perhaps Ethan Frome is the best novel written by an American. He was a totally perhapsless man. Woollcott could, as I once tried to say, his prose had the ability, the thermos bottle ability of retaining the heat of reaction for or against. He either liked or loathed. He was a jubilant cheerleader and one of the happiest executioners that I know of. Woollcott was never profound, never lived with the verities, never bothered to go much above the timberline. Nathan was somebody playing Katzenjammer Kid with Mencken, and he was somebody who did happen to have the highest critical standards and the most, from the academic point of view, of the special literature of the stage. I suppose he was as profoundly read as anyone in our time, but he always hid the knowledge, because he hated knowledge that showed. He had a proper, I think knowledge that shows too much is like a slip showing in an otherwise well-dressed woman. It ought to be there, perhaps. I'm not talking about the new fashions, but it ought to be there underneath, but it ought not to show. Nathan, of course, was somebody who played his own game, put on his own performance, and he overstated frequently, deliberately, and he exuberantly.
The shot technique?
It was a shot technique, and he was somebody whose personal taste, or writing taste, was often questionable, but whose judgment was beyond question, whose behavior was frequently bad, but whose sights and insights were simply incomparably good as a rule. He had many, many enemies, honorably won, and he did a great service by using the bulldozer and the flip gun.
What did you use?
What did I use? I don't really know. I hope all those things, because a lot of people who read the Seeing Things series in the Saturday Review thought that because I was older, that I had grown mellow. And I can only say that mellow is to me a fighting word. What those...
Not in Kentucky, surely.
Well, it depends what's mellow. If mellow means the surrender of standards, if it means mush mouth for truth, if it means you have had your fangs pulled, if it means you're no longer willing to fight for what you believe in ardently as a critic, then I think you might just as well go to the nearest undertaker, ask for the first slab, and lie down. Give yourself up and invite the formaldehyde. If mellowness means that your sense of values has not disappeared, but at least grown up to the point where you do not turn loose a howitzer on a mosquito, then I'm all for it. If mellowness also means that the theater, and this is the point I hope we can come to, means much more than the theater and has a relationship to life, then I'm all for it.
Did you have the guts to do what Nathan did, or the bravado to do what he did so often, and that is to stalk out of a play after the first act?
I don't think it was bravado in his case. I think it became a habit, a very wise habit, for a man who rather sleep at home than sleep publicly. When I was on a daily newspaper, I did leave, maybe 3 times a year. I always said so in the first paragraph, because on a daily newspaper, I had a double obligation, which I think all daily newspaper reviewers and critics face. You are a reporter as well as someone given the privilege of an opinion stated over a byline. Therefore, I think you really have to sit through as much as you can take. I don't mean that you have to expose yourself indecently to the horrors of some of these things, but I think just to cover, there's always the chance that one of the actors may die in the third act. And I said chance, not hope. And you should be present. It would have been awful from a newspaper point of view if, for example, if in Washington, on a certain historic night, you had been reviewing Our American Cousin and couldn't stand the performance and left the theater before John Wilkes Booth appeared. History would not have forgiven you.
Or your city editor. Which of these attitudes, if either, did you take? Brooks Atkinson always made it a point not to associate with actors and actresses, apparently on the theory that it might destroy his objectivity. Wolcott, on the other hand, included among his best friends the Luntz and various other actors and actresses. Now, did you take any particular stand on that?
I had a stand very much like Brooks's. I knew very few actors, and they were friends from childhood or college. And I will say, in the case of some that I did know, such as Philip Barrett, the relationship between critic and creator is such that friendship is almost bound to go AC rather than DC. And they only speak to you during the years when you've liked what they've done. And some of them won't speak to you during those years because they think it's so arrogant of you to dare to praise their work. And some of them haven't forgiven me.
Seriously?
There are some whose inability to forget is, or shall we put it more directly, whose memory of wounds is elephantine, and they still hold grudges. You forget almost every kind word ever said about you, but it's hardly anyone in this very mortal world ever fails to remember any mean word said publicly against you. There is a whole pocket in the heart, a curdle pocket, where these things are hidden. This is true.
And as a critic, you simply have to get used to that.
Oh, well, heavens, that's
after
all, you're not trying to be Miss America. You're trying to tell the truth as you see it.
When you give a play a bad review and the public likes that play, don't you sometimes wonder which one of us is right, or how wrong could I be?
No, I don't think critics should be concerned with that. A critic is a person who can speak only for himself. Certainly he is not trying to be a forecaster of what is a hit. He doesn't want it to fail.
Mhm.
He really wants things to succeed. But the critic, if he is a critic, is fighting for what is best in the theater and trying to get rid of what are in terms of art, the aesthetic delinquents. I'm not talking morals. I'm just talking.
But have you ever had any ghastly second thoughts? Have you ever thought, gee, I was really wrong about that?
I not only have had ghastly second thoughts, but when I was on the Post and on the World Telegram and on the Saturday Review, I have never hesitated, if I had true doubts within myself, to go back to see a play, and if I happened to be wrong, to correct myself in print and to apologize. I went back to see The Green Pastures. When it first opened, I happened to have been ill 2 days before. I had had flu, and so I had read Rourke Bradford. And I was one of the few people, apparently, who went to the first night having read Rourke Bradford.
The stories from which the play was taken.
Well, yes. And I was too aware of the nearness to Rourke Bradford to realize what had been the transfiguring change, both in Mark Connelly's dramatization and his rewriting of the dialogue, extension of it, and in the direction in Robert Edmund Jones's settings, and in Harrison's superb performance of DeLorde. So I did say later, when it was revived in the Saturday Review, that I had missed the boat, and it was quite a boat to miss, inasmuch as it was the Ark, and I was desperately sorry.
I'm sure you'll go to heaven anyway.
I don't know about that. Maybe that isn't the place for critics. Even if I do get there, I hope I'll never have to meet any more theatrical angels.
Is your attitude toward the plays and playwrights of the 20s as opposed to the 30s, wasn't there a tremendously sharp cleavage there? And I don't mean all of it entirely owing to the Depression, but there does seem to be a great distinction between the plays and playwrights of those two decades.
Well, I think historically surveyed, almost anyone who follows the American theater would agree that the American theater was just about beginning to grow up in the truest sense of being a playwrights and producers and designers theater just before World War I. By the end of World War I, it came into full flower, amazing flower, and the decade of the 20s, in terms of the playwriting that was done by such men as Sherwood or Sidney Howard or Mark Connelly or Paul Green,
O'Neill,
and I mean O'Neill preeminently,
Mhm.
And Kelly and all these men. This was a terribly exciting period. The 20s was a much more complex decade than is ordinarily thought of by those who can only remember gin and bathtubs and socks and John Hill drawings. It was a glorious flowering. It happened to be the same decade in which a most distinguished man who is not associated with the jazz age, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer in Germany, was finding the 20s exciting as the evolving moment for the new age of the missile and the bomb in which we now find ourselves. The outstanding American dramatist of the 20s, and indeed through the 30s, was, of course, Eugene O'Neill. What was extraordinary about O'Neill was that he was a man in this supposedly Pollyanna land who had the tragic vision of life. He was not born with this vision. He achieved it. But O'Neill, even in the worst of his short plays, was aware of the outer forces which he believed controlled men's living. In a dreadful little one-act called, I believe, The Web, he describes, in a stage direction, mind you, you can see how bad the play was, he says the leading character, I believe, is aware of the ironic life force. And another, he has people dying on a raft, fighting on a raft, a Negro, a woman in evening dress, and a man. And the sun that beats down on them mercilessly. The eye of God. O'Neill, as he grew up, outgrew, as he had to outgrow, irony. Because irony, of course, is only concerned with the trip and not the fall. He had to get beyond the O. Henry twist, or the de Maupassant twist, or the Jack London toughness. And what he did was to come back to he never lost the sense of the concern with outward forces in the lives of his private individuals. These men and women, I believe, even in O'Neill's poorer plays, seemed larger than other characters because you knew they were linked with these forces. God cared about them even as they cared about God. The Depression inevitably had its pronounced influence on a good deal of the playwriting in the during the 30s. This, never forget, was the time of the apple sellers, of bread lines, of unemployment, and also of the spread of the Communist Party. And a great many well-meaning people, alas, due to their own personal deprivations, due to their natural questioning about a society which seemed to have failed, were drawn into the periphery or into the actuality of communist work or the party line. Now that line did underwrite a great many plays produced in that period. Many of the plays were utterly childish, indeed contemptible in their simplicity. They were puerile beyond credibility, monotonous beyond endurance, because always the agitator had replaced the United States Marines, and all was safe if only somebody went to the barricades. What they would have done in the next act was never answered, but if you could start a strike and the curtain went down on the strike, that was supposed to be wonderful. I attacked one after another of these plays in my reviews in the Post, because so often they were cluttered, inchoate, and very badly written plays. But I never pretended to deny what was welcome in their vitality. And don't forget that in the same period, the person who arose as a dominant playwright was a very angry man in the proper sense of anger, not petulance but anger, and that was Clifford Odets, who did, from waiting for Lefty on to Awake and Sing, managed to, I don't know what his political beliefs were, certainly they were to the left at that time, but he did manage to release indignation at the same time that he created beauty. The best thing about those plays was the anger, the awareness of man's place in society, the questioning of the state as it functioned, the questioning of the economy. But behind the protest, there was at least vitality. And that vitality is something that, of the feeling of enraged conviction, is something that I myself miss in the theater of the 50s. But I want to get away from the theater. Do you mind if we close that makeup box just for a moment? I'm bored to death with it.
Well, of course, it was the war, actually, that did lead you away from the theater, wasn't it?
The war did, and I'm very glad, Mr. Tillman, that you asked me this, because I had lived happily in this special world for a long time. I suppose wearing the blinders which are inescapable in any profession, whether it's law, medicine, anything else. But when the war came, and when I was lucky enough to get in the Navy, and with Kirk, Admiral Kirk, certainly at 42, this was when I enlisted, the sudden confrontation with the outside world, as opposed to the world of the interpreted world, or the fictional or make-believe world, certainly it opened my eyes and changed my whole life.
For the benefit of those people who haven't read your two war books, To All Hands and Many a Watchful Night, I wonder if you could just talk very briefly about that quite unique assignment you had during the war.
Well, Mr. Tillman, this was due to Admiral Kirk. I was professionally, I should say, almost unemployable as a naval officer. I was a travesty. No Schubert company of pinafore was ever more ridiculous than I. I spent my they told me I was too old to be indoctrinated. I was flown abroad. I spent my first 2 weeks in London saluting the doorman of Claridge's and other hotels in my utter confusion. But then I finally, when we started out on the Sicilian expedition, they gave me, I never could do mathematics. Mathematics I can spend, I can subtract, but I cannot multiply, nor can I add. Anyway, they put me in calculus to determine the true wind. I did send Admiral Kirk a desperate note, and I quoted, I think accurately, it said, "Sir, will you please, so as not to give comfort to the enemy, remove me from the realms of calculus." In the profession to which I once belonged, the theater, we used to have a phrase known as miscasting. This meant that someone had tried to cast Paul Robeson to play Ophelia. This is what is happening on our ship. Please relieve me of this duty. And he did so instantly. Before we left Norfolk, Admiral Kirk had seen a showing of Desert Victory, that brilliant British film, in which General Alexander and General Montgomery, as far as security allowed, tried to explain to the troops at the front at El Alamein what was going to happen, the plan for battle, for democratic inclusion. And my job was, in Sicily and in Normandy, was to be a kind of water-soaked, wind-swept, sea-going Wolcott columnist for the ship. getting to know the people, getting to see, and so that and then before the battle, at the last moment of the engagement of the invasions, actually giving the battle plan so that each person in the complement of that ship, as far as you could possibly tell in terms of security, knew what was the plan and hence felt included. That was all Kirk's idea. I was extraordinarily lucky in having Admiral Kirk as a boss, and then I was extraordinarily lucky as a man of 42 and a permanent lieutenant in the United States Navy, the most permanent, I think, in the whole annals of the Navy. But I was, at 42, naturally, I think, aware of values which men of 20s hadn't yet become conscious of or had no reason to challenge. I had the absolutely eye-opening experience of seeing this outside world, and I hope coming back from it different and enriched. I've never ceased to love the theater, but my interest ever since the war has been in the relationship between the theater and life, or any of the arts and life. The ivory tower, which once existed, could exist, when people were deceived in the deceptive 20s. Of course, I saw with my own eyes, and so did everyone else, turn into a shell crater in World War II, and none of us know what happens from now on in.
Even before the war, you always had very definite political attitudes, didn't you?
I hope I had political attitudes. I know they have grown, and they've grown in strength and in conviction, and this again comes from being thrown out of a special hooded world into the blinding sunlight of actuality.
Was it the coming of the Roosevelt era that first strengthened your convictions?
When Mr. Roosevelt first began to do his fireside talks, and from the moment of his first inaugural, and with the economic demands within this country, now long accepted by both Republicans and Democrats, what the president did, due to the urgency of events, was to conduct one of the greatest courses in social activities that history has known. And the whole country went to school learning a new idea and a new concept of America. And the America today is the America that had to emerge under the economic pressures of those particular times under the two emergencies, domestic first, and unemployment, and then, of course, war, which brought about a subsequent solidarity.
I think that's an extremely lucid statement of some of the phases that America went through. But as for you personally, you had to earn a living after the war. How did you decide what to do?
Under Norman Cousins, the Saturday Review was beginning to become a larger and larger magazine, and it had not become the very large magazine that it now is. But Norman gave me the chance to do a weekly column called Seeing Things on almost any subject that I wanted. And in other words, undertake the essay review type of writing, which is very rare because very few magazines have the space for it. I welcome the challenge of this kind of column and the opportunity that seemed to me heaven sent. I remember, this is when I became actively interested in politics, when Norman Cousins said, "Why don't you cover the Republican and Democratic conventions?" And he sent me to Chicago, and that's when then I followed Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson on their trains. This was in '52, and then wrote this book through these men about some aspects of our passing history. But I go back to this because there again it was a whole change and broadening, I hope, of interest. And I remember, as you come to the question of knowledge, and when you come as opposed, say, to learning and knowledge as opposed to wisdom, may I come back to a speech made in '54. It was an extemporaneous speech made at Princeton by Adlai Stevenson. And at this senior class banquet in Princeton, Stevenson was discussing what is the difference between what a man knows at 50 and what a man knew at 20. And Stevenson said, what he knows at 50 that he did not know at 20 boils down to something like this. The knowledge he has acquired with age is not the knowledge of formulas or forms of words, but of people, places, actions, a knowledge not gained by words, but by touch, sight, sound, victories, failures, sleeplessness, devotion, love, the human experiences and emotions of this earth and of oneself and of other men, and perhaps, too, a little faith and a little reverence for the things you cannot see. And with that, I wholeheartedly agree.
I think I ought to make it very clear that through these men, you go into infinitely more subjects than politics, though. The wonderful chapters on Justice Frankfurter and Walter Lippmann and Robert Oppenheimer.
What I was discussing in Through These Men is what does interest me, and that is the theory of leadership in any field. Walter Lippmann, preeminence, for example, in journalism, or Frankfurter on the bench, or Stevenson and Eisenhower as national figures, or Lodge as the leader at the UN. These various men I wrote about because what I was concerned with is what it is that makes the man outstanding in history. I was not trying to follow the great man theory, which is now despised, though I happen to believe to a certain extent in the great man theory. I was trying to say that history, practically, is the failure or success of men placed in positions of responsibility to meet the challenges of that responsibility as they should. And that is where the caprice of history comes in, and where the individual matters, I think, incontestably.
Well, in each of these instances, the man did rise to the occasion. It seems to me there might be a fascinating book about men who are unable to meet that challenge or face up to the responsibilities. Indeed, I think the whole subject of greatness itself is a fascinating theme. Men who, faced with the necessary challenge, were able to rise to it. Other men, seemingly as gifted, who were unable to do so. And during our next discussion, Mr. Brown, I would like us to devote our full time to a consideration of greatness as it applies in the battlefield or in the halls of Congress and in science and the humanities as well.